17 years. 17 years. Look at that. I do have a memory. And he is the chair or head of the Interfaith Council here in Florida. So I'm gonna let him tell you more about himself, and then open up the floor for questions for Q&A. We're gonna do hand raises as well, and then anything that he can't get through before the end of the the Q&A session, I'm sure we'll stay for like 5 extra minutes and have some conversations with you after. Rabbi, okay, if you please welcome him also for doing this last minute, please.
Oh, okay. All right. That's a little better. Glad to be here. Thank you. As Stephen said, I do chair the Interfaith Council of Central Florida, and have been involved in interfaith work since I got here with that organization, and then in communities that I served before that. And even growing up, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Excuse me. I was born and raised in Chicago, but I'm born and raised in a far southwest corner of the city, which during that time was virulently racist and anti-Semitic. Just to give you an example of how virulently racist it was, Martin Luther King, I saw an interview with him, a taped interview with him many years later after his assassination. And he was being asked, did he ever fear for his life? And he said twice. First was the famous moment at the Pettus Bridge that's recorded in the film Selma. And the second one was an open housing march in my neighborhood in Chicago, where he was fearing for his life. So that was the atmosphere there when it came to race relations. Anti-Semitism, I will just say that the headquarters of the American Nazi Party in Chicago was 2 blocks away from the synagogue that I grew up at. So there you go. And some of the people who were members there were guys I went to high school with. So you can do the math from there. My work with the Interfaith Council has been deeply rewarding because it's allowed me to develop what we call interfaith literacy. That's different than religious literacy. Religious literacy is I know things about other faith traditions, and I know perhaps what they believe, their sacred texts, what their holidays are. Interfaith literacy is more a sense of understanding the needs of people who are different from you. So that's one of the many ways that the mission statement of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida overlaps with that of the Holocaust Center here. So my function here is to answer your questions. Jews are all about the questions. I would mention 3 things before we get started with that. The first is sometimes people will say, I would like to ask this question, but I'm afraid I'm going to upset you, or it's going to be disrespectful, or it's going to be offensive. To quote one of my teachers in rabbinical school, I've been insulted by better people than you. I'm sure I have not. I've been insulted, but not by better people than you. But his point there was, no question is out of bounds if it's a sincere question. And the second thing is something that my mother of blessed memory taught me from a very early age, which is that a question is something that you want to know. It's not a statement. It's not an opportunity to make a speech. It's really something that you don't know the answer to. And if you do know the answer to, or you expect to have an answer that you know, or you want to respond with your own answer to the question, it's not really a question. It's a statement. Not that those aren't valid questions, but we only have a limited amount of time.
I should have made that statement well on. I love that.
And then the third thing really is that this is a safe space. So, if you have a sincere question, by all means ask. Sometimes, I will tell you, there's a long history of this. Jews answer questions with questions, particularly rabbis. If you ask me something and I ask you a question back, I'm not being disrespectful. I'm not being sassy. I'm doing really what the Talmud does, which is reframe the question, your own question, just a little bit to deepen our understanding of it. So, with that in mind, fire away.
Thank you for being here. I am a high school teacher. I teach 9th grade English. It's my first year at the high school, but I went to that high school. Not a lot of Jews in that community, but those of us who are there are pretty tight-knit. Recently, I've seen a surge in anti-Semitism at my school. I don't think it's intentional. A lot of kids are getting their news off of TikTok, and I'm sure as many of us know, TikTok is not always the most accurate or favorable resource. My question is this: knowing that teachers have restrictions on what they're allowed to say with their own political and religious views, right? In Florida, we can't voice that on students. How can I redirect a conversation in which students are accusing Israel of genocide, students are using derogatory remarks to talk about Israelis and Jews and soldiers? How can I redirect that in a way that is appropriate, but also I need it to be accurate, I need it to be appropriate. I also need it to not cross a line where I lose my job, because there are very angry parents that are just waiting for teachers to make mistakes like that. It's sad, but it's a reality I think several people in this room could deal with. I'm totally fine with you answering that with a question. Bring it. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, it's complicated. I will make a slight editorial comment that you would be more likely to run into trouble and possibly lose your job for a political statement rather than a theological one, unfortunately. That's where we're at in Florida right now. And the chaplain's bill, which goes into effect on July 1st, is going to allow for people who represent a faith tradition but have no qualification other than a background check to walk into public schools and meet with students. But putting that aside for a minute, it's something that both chaplains and clergy don't like, by the way, just in case anybody was wondering. When you hear that kind of thing going on, sometimes it's helpful to reflect it to the student. The temptation is to say, here's why you're wrong, right? You're young, you don't know what you're talking about, you're getting your information from TikTok, you're wrong. I can't think of a time when that approach has swayed someone, where they've suddenly said, you know what, you're right, I've totally got this backwards. So often the best thing to do is just sort of reflect what they're saying back to them and ask those questions. So, if they say, Israel's committing genocide, what is genocide? Let's talk history. Let's talk definitions. Let's talk, what boxes do you have to check to say this is a genocide? And to be honest enough to say, a couple of those boxes do get checked. Masses of people are being moved. Civilians are dying. So that's the second thing I would say, is concede the truth of what's true, even if it's an inconvenient truth or an uncomfortable truth. Yes, there are a lot of civilians dying. The response to someone showing compassion, in my view, and this is actually the view of the tradition as well, although I know there are those in my community who would disagree with me, but the view of the tradition is, the answer to someone who is expressing concern and compassion for people who are suffering is not to say, yeah, but on this side of the border, they're suffering too. The answer is to say, yes, that's suffering, and nobody wants to see people suffer and die. So agreement as far as facts allow you, but also reflecting some of those points back with questions that are not challenging, but are just like, help me understand what you mean, right? I'll share a personal example, because that's, talk about what you know. I was invited to speak at an interfaith iftar, right? Breaking the fast in the Muslim tradition during the month of Ramadan, recently concluded. And one of the sponsors of this event, of course, he saw, a rabbi, and he wanted to make sure that, that I passed muster. And he did a lot of digging, and he found something online that he disagreed with me on. We had a very, very uncomfortable but really important and constructive conversation about this. On the other end of that conversation, I was able to say, look, I understand why that's uncomfortable and that's hurtful for you, that I said that. I still stand by the validity of what I said, but now I understand how you heard it, and I'm going to be more aware and more careful in the future of how and when I say what I said. So didn't change anybody's mind. He was still absolutely certain that he was correct and I was wrong, but there was the opportunity to come to some understanding, to, I'm going to quote the mission statement of the Interfaith Council here, to embrace a reconcilable difference.
Hi, Rabbi. I had a question at the last session about the Catholic Church, and I didn't know you were coming, because you also are a good person to ask this very same question, because I took a class with you on Abraham Joshua Heschel. I was wondering if you could give us a little insight on your thoughts about how the conversation that Rabbi Heschel had with Pope John the 23rd might have helped or influenced the changing of church doctrine about the things that led to what we would call anti-Semitic actions. So like the killing of Jesus by the Jews and other things. I just wondered, because I know you're knowledgeable about him, and you're also very skilled in dialogue. So I wonder, how do you think his conversation with the Pope helped move that conversation in a better direction?
Thank you. I don't have deep knowledge of that specific aspect, but I will just say this. For anyone who is not familiar, Abraham Joshua Heschel, of blessed memory, was really one of the important and influential theologians and thinkers of the 20th century, and marched with Martin Luther King. Eventually, it came out very clearly in his opposition to the war in Vietnam. He famously sent a telegram to the President of the United States, saying that it's not enough to say that we support civil rights. The time calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity, is what he said. And his message to the Pope at that time was pretty much the same thing. And I'm gonna shift away from Heschel for a minute to another one of my heroes, whose stuff I've read and I didn't understand at all. But fortunately, I took a class with a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary who did understand it, and helped me understand it. In 1956, there was a gathering of religious leaders from all over the world, wide spectrum of faith traditions, and they were reflecting on the Holocaust. And sort of one at a time, they were saying, we didn't do everything that we should have. We have to forgive ourselves. We have to move on, and we have to commit to not letting this happen again. Present at that gathering was a French Jewish philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, who essentially got up in front of this group of august individuals and said, "No, you don't get off that easy. The truth is, if all of you had followed the teachings of your respective faith traditions, the Holocaust would have never happened. And that's what you have to own." And he wrote an essay called "Religion for Adults," which I highly recommend reading, but you probably need a teacher to get through it, because I didn't understand it when I just read it. I bring up Levinas in connection with Heschel, because that was pretty much the message. Was, here's what you teach, here's what you did, here's what you didn't do, and here's the impact that your teachings and your words are having. I was just noticing this. Words become the first front in the Nazis' war, right? Words matter. They're very powerful. And if we think, we just said something and it was just a joke, somebody doesn't hear it as just a joke. You need to be aware of that. It kind of comes back to what's Sasha's question too. Deborah Lipstadt, who wrote some wonderful books and I think still serves as a consultant on anti-Semitism for the U.S. government. She talks about clueless anti-Semitism, right? Or as my great-grandmother used to say, they mean well, which was the worst thing she would ever say about anybody. If my great-grandmother said, he means well, it was like, oh boy. Right? And I think that was part of Heschel's message as well. I don't care how well-meaning, and more respectful than that, I'm sure, but I don't care how well-meaning you are and what your intentions are and what you preach as your belief system. I want to see what happens on the ground. And that starts with what you say and how you say it. And that is also, by the way, a fundamental precept in Rabbinic Judaism. It's not what you say, it's how you act that determines what kind of a person you are. Questions? Get my good side.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I don't have a good side.
So this has I have struggled to understand this concept. With I don't have many Jewish friends, I might add, if any. I have an internet friend who's Jewish, but why do we see so much atheism among Jewish people? Especially for myself, I consider myself to be Christian. I will read the Psalms, I will read the book of Ruth, Esther, and just cry my eyes out as I read these things, like the Ruth with her mother-in-law, your God will be my God, and I'm just so moved. And then when the Jewish people consider how their people have survived throughout the ages, I mean, we weren't allowed to talk about before Common Era before, but we can talk about ancient Egyptians, we can talk about the Chinese, and their history goes back. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't we have the artifact, a lot of archaeological evidence for ancient Israel, and correct me if I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. So then I look at the Holocaust, and I look at and I'm just struggling. Why would other people outside of the Jewish culture, why would they have all this or belief in those ancient texts, the Talmud, or however you call it, the Tanakh or whatever? Why would they have find so much hope and comfort in that? And then I guess I want to understand, because I have a hint that it's pain. There's a lot of pain there. But I guess I want to hear your perspective.
Yeah, well, so an interesting thing, Judaism from its inception in biblical religion, biblical Israelite religion, has functioned on two levels, but simultaneously. They're not separate. One is on a theological level, and one is on a sense of peoplehood, of national identity, and those are inseparable. So it's somewhat ironic that Jews come to the United States, and this becomes the place where we're not free from persecution, but where we've had the most freedom of movement and ability to believe, in a country that hopefully will continue to very clearly separate religion and state, right? We're a tradition that doesn't do that. We're a people, we're a religion. It's the same thing. In fact, when someone embraces Judaism by choice, we don't say welcome to the Jewish religion. We say, welcome to the Jewish people. You're Am Yisrael, you're the people of Israel. There really isn't a word in biblical or rabbinic Hebrew that has the same force as the word religion in English. We can say dat, which is a belief system, but it's not quite the same. So I'm not quite so sure that that atheism is the right word, and here's why. The Central Florida Free Thought Community, which, as the chair says, is your friendly neighborhood agnostics and atheists, have a seat on the Interfaith Council because they represent a significant percentage of people in our community, people who don't subscribe to any faith tradition, who are not affiliated with any denomination, or who simply don't have any faith tradition at all, right? But even within the Central Florida Free Thought community, there's a little bit of a problem when they're trying to get their people together, because people will say, I'm an atheist, but what they mean is I'm an agnostic. I believe in some kind of higher power. There's some kind of organizing force in the universe, but I can't believe in an old man in a white robe with a long beard who sits on a chair in the sky and judges everybody. And whenever somebody says that to me, and I've spoken to many of especially young people who claim to be atheists, and they'll say that to me, I'll say, well, then I must be an atheist too, because I don't believe that. In fact, the tradition that you belong to doesn't believe that either. Second, when it comes to the sacred text, Judaism is an interpretive tradition. And one of the reasons why we would talk about the last 2,000 years is that's really the history of rabbinic Judaism. So the remarkable part about being an interpretive tradition is no matter what happens in your history, you can adapt. So if Judaism had clung to the idea that in our primary sacred text it talks about offering these sacrifices on these days, and these are the people who can do it, and these people can't do it, and there's this small clan of priests who perform this function, and they have to be in a state of ritual purity. When all of that came crashing down in 70 of the Common Era, and people were scattered to the four winds, that should have been the end of Judaism. It should have been, because we lost our central our central place of worship. The priesthood was scattered. They became ritually impure, because if you even just walk over where a dead body was, you're ritually impure. It should have been the end, and it wasn't, because there was the adaptability. There was a way to say, we're rooted in this text, but we can interpret it in a legitimate and authoritative way, so that we can live in the modern world. Now, whether the modern world was the first century of the Common Era, or the modern world is 2024, or any of that time in between. So that's really what made the difference. And that's what has allowed Judaism to adapt and survive despite everything that's happened over the centuries. No, that was the Roman sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. You still got a couple centuries to go before Rome falls, but. Yeah. It's important to make a distinction between a political state and the people of Israel. Okay. So the people of Israel have existed that entire time. All right. What ended up happening, and it really happened a few centuries before. You have to understand the ancient world, and we don't have enough time to go through the whole thing. But in the 6th century before the Common Era, 586 BCE, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, that entity was still a state, so to speak, but it was a vassal state to a larger empire. That's the way the ancient world works, right? That's a whole unit you might want to do sometime. When does an exile become a diaspora? All right, how many centuries do you have to be in exile before it's just diaspora? But the exile after the Roman conquest in the 1st century, and really moving into the 2nd century in the Bar Kokhba revolt, but this isn't history class, sorry. From that point on, Jews are scattered, but there is still a remnant population in that geographical location. And that remnant population is larger or smaller depending on how things are going, but it never goes away completely. So if we can explode one myth in our modern times and in our current very fraught times, if we could explode one myth, it would be that there was some period of time where, and I'm not using the word to cast aspersions on anybody else in history, but the myth is there was some period of time where this geographical region was Judenrein, and that there were no Jews living there at all. And that simply isn't true. There was always somebody there. There was some residual Jewish population in that region. So, you know.
Jennifer, I want to give it because for time,
Yeah.
I really need to let some other people have questions here. I just to kind of, because we're running out of time.
I'm just going to say one thing about borders. Another phrase that really should go away is the phrase biblical Israel. These are the borders of the Holy Land in the Bible, because the references to the boundaries of the Holy Land in the Bible don't agree with each other, and we make up borders. Another question? Yeah.
You mentioned you were in that the interfaith council. Do you have activities or groups for children, maybe like 10 to teens, that they can incorporate to learn more about people, to build that empathy?
Yeah, great question. We don't have anything right now. I mean, like everybody else, we kind of got our programming kind of got hammered during COVID. But I mean, we do have the opportunity for classrooms or community centers or community groups, youth groups, stuff like that. We can provide speakers, we can provide programming that way. Programming specifically for children right now of our own, we do not have. We had started working on a 1-week summer camp program, and we got one summer in as a pilot program, and then everything shut down. Yes, sir.
Mark?
Yeah, I was just wanting to know more about the Interfaith Council. How are the relations, and are there any faiths lacking that you wish would become part of it?
So there are, in addition to the free thought community, there are 8 major faith traditions. We don't go by denomination because then we'd have 400,000 representatives. But then there are 8 major faith traditions. See if I can remember them all in alphabetical order. Baha'i, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. I'm up to 5, right? Sikh, Sanatana Dharma, also known as Hinduism among white people, and Unitarian Universalist. We don't have a representative of the Jains. However, we've been doing a series at the Winter Park Library called One World, Many Beliefs, and we're taking faith traditions more or less in chronological order, and we have already heard from the Jains and from the Zoroastrians, and it was difficult to find those communities, connect with them, and get speakers, but we did, and I'm glad we did because it was very informative. So there are certain denominations within those faith traditions that, shall we say, don't play well with others. They don't necessarily even play well with others within their own faith tradition. And so they tend not to be represented. We have a traditions council, which are representatives from those 9 communities. We've weighted them so that a majority faith tradition like Christianity doesn't have the majority of votes, because we want to hear all the voices. Since October 7th, we've had some very difficult conversations. Very, very positive thing, and the thing that really, keeps my heart from shattering entirely is that I've been doing this work in this area for 20 years, and so have a lot of the other people who are involved. And so we've built these relationships, we've built the trust, we've built the friendship, and as I mentioned, our mission statement starts out saying we embrace an irreconcilable difference. We're able to do that. We're able to sit down at a table together and say, I know that you and I disagree pointedly on several points, and right now in our perspectives. And yet that doesn't stop me from maintaining my relationship with you, and we can have this conversation. The week after October 7th, the president of the Islamic Society of Central Florida and I published a joint statement in the Orlando Sentinel, condemning the attack, and also saying whatever's happening next, and this is before Israel began its military response, whatever else happens in that part of the world, we're living in this community, and we maintain our love and respect for each other. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi there. So I got a problem in my classroom. I teach American literature, Huck Finn, Into the Wild, Great Gatsby, and now we've introduced Night. And invariably, got to mention, I teach public school in Seminole County. And typically in the beginning of the year, we'll cover Huck Finn, and any chance I get to integrate the Bible is always an eye-opening experience for not only Chris, even legal. And invariably, I will have rich conversations with these students who are well-versed in the Bible after class. During class, there's hesitation, reservation, ways that I can, as an educator, get these students to speak freely about their faith. I feel like so many of them, the whole class conversation. Are there any strategies that you can kind of share that might help me as an English teacher and
the first thing I would say, and I please understand, I always come from a place of love and respect. The first thing I would say is the Hebrew Bible is not English literature. If you're quoting it in English, you're quoting a translation, which is an interpretation. And the Christian scripture was not written in English either. It was written in Greek. So I would have a question in my mind, and I do have a question in my mind of the appropriateness of bringing foreign literature into an English literature class. Just on a strictly logical and pedagogical level. The second thing that would be concerning for me is whose faith are we talking about? Many of us in this room, at least from our physical appearance, don't know what it's like to be a racial minority. And so we really have to be careful about how we talk about race when we're in the majority, at least for now, right? I personally, and I'm sure there's people who disagree with me, but personally, I wish I could live to see the day when there's enough interracial marriage and interracial children born that it sort of makes racism extinct on its own, because race is a social construct. There's no genetic basis for saying there's a difference between us. Undergraduate degree in ecology, ethology, and evolution. So I do have a basis for saying that. In terms of students, expressing themselves because of the perspective of their faith tradition, as a teacher and a teacher's kid, I would say that it would be really, really important to emphasize to them this is a great way to make a distinction between your personal analysis, in other words, opinion, versus fact, right? Because when it comes right down to it, the whole basis of faith is taking something that we can't see, touch, or prove. I mean, that's what faith is, right? When we say religious faith, that's what we're talking about. I can't hand you a handful of God, so there's no way to weigh it or measure it or tell us what color it is. So that's a great opportunity. That's a teachable moment, a pedagogical opportunity to help students understand that you can express your opinion through your lens, but you have to be honest about what your lens is. So how to recognize your own bias. And when I say that, that's not critical, right? Not critical in the sense of I'm criticizing you, but critical in the sense of literary critical. I have a bias. I know I have a bias. I'm being in the clergy, right? For 17 years here at Ohev Shalom, I was being paid to be professionally biased, really, to present the world through a particular lens that I was trained for a long time to be able to describe. But I also have to be able to say, I know that's my lens, and there are other lenses.
We have one more that hasn't, and then we're going to kind of wrap up because Talli needs to present, and we also have another lecture as well. Well, she's really insisted on it. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. And if you want to have a conversation after or outside,
I will give you my email address too. I will respond.
I guess if I can try and articulate my question, I know we don't compare sufferings, and so events in history not to be compared. But then you made the comment just a moment ago, like kind of just physically based, right? So some people, for lack of a better expression, maybe could hide behind the color of their skin, whereas others can't, right? And so do you ever get pushback in your work with Holocaust education from maybe persons that have experienced other types of historic suffering and of maybe, and this, forgive me if this is wrong terminology, of like white privilege, of being able to educate in such a way, whereas maybe other groups don't have that same organization or the fragmentation among. I think you know where I'm going with the question. Yeah. Maybe, I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Don't apologize. Don't apologize. I'm aware of my privilege, right? I mean, I'm a white male, and that gives me certain privilege that I wouldn't have if I was a person of color or a woman. I'm also, let's take it all the way down to the ground. I am a cis hetero white male, and so I enjoy all the privileges that go with that. I'm also a Jew, and I'm open about my Judaism, and so I also have to own what goes with that. Whether somebody on a bus in New York when I was in rabbinical school, when something was I was the second. It was probably the second Intifada. No, probably second Intifada, where somebody came up to me on a bus because I was wearing a kippah and said, "Don't let them take Jerusalem." It's like, I don't really have anything to do with that. I'm here on this bus, and I'm on the M3 with you in Manhattan. I really am. But that person saw me as a representation of all Jews everywhere. I take the anti-Semitism, I take the bias, and take people who are well-meaning, who say things to me as well. All right, that goes with it. I own that too. That's in my backpack, as the saying goes. In terms of comparative suffering, or if I say, if we're talking about the Holocaust and somebody says, well, that's nothing compared to, right? I mean, my first response is, the death of a total of 11 million people, 12 million people is not nothing. That is, frankly, and I ended up saying this to somebody one time who was being very insistent. I said, that's how Stalin talked, right? One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. If you're going to reduce the number of people who died to a statistic and you're going to compare statistics, we've already lost our humanity. We're not talking about human beings anymore. We're talking about numbers, right? When it comes to other things, American slavery, Darfur, unfortunately, there's a very long list. My response and the way we handle things in the Interfaith Council with those kind of conversations is kind of what I'm saying to Sasha, is to say, yes, that is true. That is true. There were probably more Russians killed, Russian citizens killed in World War II than the total number of Jews. Now, what was the percentage of people? Great, but let's put the numbers game aside and say, yes, that is a fact. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the systematic attempt at genocide, to remove an entire population, an entire group of people from the population, as a explicit government policy. Okay, so let's talk about that thing. And I'll just wrap this way. This is why I am pretty adamant about not using words like Holocaust or apartheid when talking about anything else that isn't the Holocaust or apartheid. So if we're talking about, Israel, and we say Israel is an apartheid state, time out. Apartheid happened in a particular place at a particular time for particular reasons. Let's not dilute the historical reality of apartheid by using it as a metaphor for something else. I think that's where I would leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if you want, I will, if Rabbi K will tell me what email he would like me to share with you, we'll share his email in the chat. If you'd like to just
yeah, it's David, D-A-V-I-D, you can spell my own name, at GoldmanK, GoldmanKay.net. Goldman being my spouse's family name and K being my family name. And by the way, if you happened to Google my name, Rabbi David K, be sure that you spell it K-A-Y. Do not put an E on the end. First of all, that's not how the family spells it. We didn't shorten it from anything, but also because there is somebody who is a rabbi and spelled their last name that way, and was featured on To Catch a Predator about 20 years ago. So please do not mistake us.
Wow. Thank you so much. So we're going to take just 5 minutes, then everybody online, this is not, don't go anywhere. Talli's going to present. We're just going to get everything set up and ready. Thank you, Rabbi K, for giving up your lunch and your afternoon. Feel free to join. And just 5-minute break really quick.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. I just want to start off by saying that hearing from a 3G, a grandchild of survivor, is never the same thing as hearing from a survivor. So I am sorry that that Alan's not here with us. but I'm honored to share my grandmother's story. And because you're all educators, I'm going to ask you if you can pretend that it is exactly 1 month ago. So this is a presentation that was created for Yom HaShoah, and the presentation itself was created by an intern. So it's just a few pictures to help us imagine what I'm going to share. But 1 month ago exactly, instead of it being today is Tess Wise, our Holocaust survivor who started the center. Today would be her 101st birthday, in addition to the commemoration of D-Day, but we're going to pretend that it's exactly a month ago and that it's Yom HaShoah. So lots of amazing things that represent today, but when I speak, you're going to hear me talk about a different day that we're going to go back a little bit in time, only because when Stephen called me last night and asked me to present, what I have available is from Yom HaShoah. So you guys are great with imagination. So as a child, there was no option of not knowing Yom HaShoah. For 2 minutes at 10 a.m., the world stops entirely as a siren wails throughout the country. And I remember the only sound I could hear of my heart. School children dressed in all white participate in commemoration ceremonies where they hear from survivors about their excruciating experiences and what they had to overcome to build their lives. In America, clearly, Yom HaShoah is different. It's not a national holiday, but it falls upon Jewish communities or Holocaust organizations to ensure that Holocaust commemorations happen. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to speak today to honor the legacy of the victims, survivors, and liberators. I'm honored to share my grandmother's story. Shoah Holocaust Remembrance Day falls on the 20th in 2024. It fell on May 6th, today. HaShoah VeHaGevurah, literally meaning the day of remembrance of the Holocaust and heroism. Gevurah also means strength. The word Shoah appears in the Bible more than a dozen times and signifies complete and utter destruction. To call this day Yom HaShoah, a day for remembering the horrific destruction of Jewish communities under Nazis' reign of terror, only tells half the story. We need today to be one of remembrance of heroism, strength, and determination as well. First, the day is designated for remembering the destruction. We light candles and remember the horrors and the devastating loss. Second, the day is for remembering heroism and strength. We celebrate the strength of the victims and the determination of the survivors. And remember in Hebrew is not passive, but active. Our remembering and witnessing is meant to move us to do everything in our power to prevent genocides from happening again by taking a stand against hate in all its forms. Next slide. Both in Israel and in America, hearing Holocaust testimonies is at the core of this day. Holocaust survivor Ellie tells people that you should become more sensitive to yourself, to your friends, even to strangers. Become sensitive to stories of what we try to tell, but also what happens even today. Because what happens today is always related to what happened then. He believed that by hearing another person's story, a sacred responsibility was bestowed upon you. You become a witness. So today, as I recall and bear witness to my grandmother's story of devastation, despair, determination, and strength, let us consider the legacy she left all of us and the ways her story calls us to create positive change. I remember her as my sweet grandmother, and I already mentioned this to you, knew nothing about her. My sweet grandmother, who made the best matzo ball soup, had a smile that could light up the room, and the softest hands I've ever felt. Next slide. Sorry, it's deciding to do something funny. My grandmother was born in the industrial town of Lodz in central Poland. It was the second largest city in Poland at the time, with a diverse Jewish population. The town had approximately 230,000 Jews, who made up a third of the community. It was an industrial textile city. My grandmother came from a large, you can go to the next slide, close-knit family. In fact, this picture of the family. Her childhood was filled with family celebrations, laughter, and love. The family business was metalworking, and many of the aunts, uncles, and cousins were employed in the business. And as I mentioned yesterday, when you look at this picture, she is the only one to have survived out of this entire picture. My grandmother recalls the fanfare when the Nazis occupied her city. Because her city was reserved for German resettlement, it was annexed to Germany and renamed Blitzmannstadt. From spending time with her non-Jewish friends, humiliating laws forbade her from walking on the sidewalk, sitting on a bench, and she was ordered to wear a yellow star with the word Jew on her garments. She recalled learning from her grandparents' neighbor. This time, her father was beaten by the Nazis, and she recalls that he was never the same person after that experience. She actually talked about how she could tell looking in his eyes that something had changed. He was disillusioned, filled with fear, dread, and disbelief. He felt the Germans were so cultured and civilized that he could not compute what was happening around him, no longer accept his reality. Although the occupation marks the beginning of despair for my grandmother, she still recalls moments of joy, family gatherings, and her mother constantly trying to make the new normal not so bad. And there's a lot in her testimony and her mom. In fact, she was featured in Echoes and Reflections in a unit called Mothers and Daughters, because it talks specific roles that motherhood and women play in a small area and detaching them from the outside world. The ghetto was surrounded by barbed wire fencing, and anyone caught trying to escape was killed. Living conditions in the ghetto were horrendous. On average, 8 to 10 people lived in each room. My grandmother and her family were assigned a tiny room with no running water or sewer system. Due to the filth, disease such as typhus spread. Her mother was resourceful and came up with tactics to make everyday life more manageable. To make her bed, and the bed was located in the kitchen. She said the simple act of making her bed would remind her that normal times were not that far away. As the population in the ghetto continued to grow, with daily transports delivering Jews from all over Nazi-occupied Europe, the ghetto was overcrowded, and during its operation, more than 20% of the population died as a result of the miserable living conditions. The ghetto was administered by Rumkowski. Rumkowski found himself in an impossible position between obeying Nazi orders and trying to help Jews cope with the hardship of life in the ghetto. The philosophy that guided his leadership was salvation through labor, a flawed notion too valuable for Nazi authorities to murder. Unfortunately, all various camps as laborers only did so because the machinery of death did not catch up to them before the end of the war. My grandmother recalls the first moment of resolve through an interaction with the leader, Rumkowski. She had a friend whose parents just an informal adoption process, but the adoption was not approved. One day, as my grandmother was on her way to visit her boyfriend at a work factory, she saw Rumkowski on his horse carriage to ask him if her friend could be approved for adoption. As he came down from his carriage, my grandmother anticipated that he would help her friend, but instead, he slapped her across the face, got back on his carriage, and left. My grandmother was stunned. She quickly recovered and never regretted making the request, but she talks about that as a turning point. The incident sparked within her the strength that this day, Yom HaShoah, with the flawed and deluded Rumkowski, will and determination to overcome the insurmountable challenges that lay ahead. Next slide. The Lodz ghetto became a production center under the Nazi occupation, with creation of factories and the availability of free forced labor. By July 1942, you can go to the next one, producing everything from ammunition to textile. Most notably for a group of 300 individuals with similar metal working skills, my grandmother's family was assigned to work at the factory. The work conditions were harsh, and the demand to produce an enormously high set number of goods was beyond their abilities. As compensation, workers received a portion of soup each day and a slice of bread. During my grandmother's 4 years in the ghetto, she managed to maintain her resolve that the situation would improve. She endured the difficult days by envisioning a better future. As she watched many of her friends and family members being deported from the ghetto, told that they were being relocated but never heard from again. But the darkest chapter that she talked about was the tragedy that befell the children of Lodz, and was the most heart-rending. She just qualified because of her age. She was 16 at the time and passed as an 18-year-old to not be qualified as a child. It was announced that the children would be taken and resettled to a better place, offering more food and better living conditions. Jewish children all over Nazi murdered. My grandmother's family had heard rumors of extermination camps, but to them at that time, they were unbelievable. She talks about this in detail. She even had an encounter with someone who had escaped from a camp to tell them in the ghetto that they should not believe what they are hearing and that those who were relocated were murdered. But my grandmother's father convinced her and told her that these were just rumors. Next slide. In January 1942, deportations from Lodz to Chelmo murder site began. It was the first stationary facility where poison gas was used for the murder of Jews. There were only 75,000 Jews left in the ghetto, and it was decided that the metal factory workers would be relocated to a different location to keep working towards the war effort. Fall 1944, the remaining inhabitants were ordered to walk to a nearby train station with their few belongings. My grandmother was on the last transport to leave the ghetto. She recalls black boots, dogs, guns, and being herded onto cattle cars, train ride. She recalls the pervasive stench, hearing children cry, no idea what the future held for them. Next slide. Upon entering Auschwitz, she thought they had arrived at an insane asylum when she saw people wearing striped uniforms. Soon she would be wearing one as well. Immediately, men and women were separated through a selection process. Younger, healthier people were sent to one side, and older people and children to another. They were ordered to leave their belongings on the train and told they would be reunited later. Of all the horrific experiences that my grandmother endured, the processing at the camp was the most humiliating. She came from a religious family, and so what she was exposed to was nothing that she could have ever been prepared for. She was ordered to take off her clothes in front of men, placed in a room with shower heads. Water came out of the shower, but not far away, there was a building built to the same specifications where the old, and by old I mean over age 40, sick and children were taken, and instead of water, poisonous gas descended on them. She was then shaven from head to toe, her long braids cut off, and she was issued dry pajamas and wooden shoes. She recalls seeing a reflection of herself in the mirror and not recognizing that girl. Her recollection of this time was very blurry. No doubt due to the trauma. In the Spielberg, she was marched outside to be counted, which left and a dry piece of bread. They were not given spoons, as they were not considered human. When one hears Auschwitz, gas chambers most often come to mind, but Auschwitz was far more complex. There was Auschwitz I, the main concentration camp on the outskirts of Auschwitzim in German-occupied Poland, that was established in 1940, and Auschwitz II, most often known as Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center 2 miles from the main camp, which the prisoners were first to build. More than 40 Auschwitz subcamps, exploiting the prisoners as slave laborers at various German industrial plants between 1943 and 1944. An estimated 1.3 million people were sent by the Nazis to Auschwitz between the years 1940 and 1945. Of those deportees, 1.1 million people were murdered. The majority of those who arrived at Auschwitz were sent directly to the gas chambers, primarily mothers with young children, babies, children under age 14, and elderly, as I mentioned, over the age of 40. While the vast majority were Jews, 74,000 Poles, 21,000 Roma, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 15,000 other nationalities were murdered there. During the Holocaust, Auschwitz, and only those incoming prisoners selected for work rather than death were assigned a camp serial number, which was sewn to their prison uniforms and emblazoned on their skin. Deemed capable of work, my grandmother and her family were assigned prisoner serial numbers, but not tattooed, as their time at Auschwitz would be brief. And this was during 1944. So this was during the period where the Hungarian Jews were arriving at the same time, and the ramp had been expanded in Birkenau to be closer to the gas chambers to make the killing process more productive. On to a destination unknown. Go to the next slide. Days later, they arrived at a second camp called Stutthof in Germany. It was every 1933 and 1945. The camps ranged in purpose from forced labor to detention, and those deemed to be enemies of the state to mass murder. Conditions in Stutthof were brutal. Many prisoners died from the typhus epidemic that swept the camp in the winter of 1942 and again in 1944 when my grandmother arrived. Those who the SS guards judged too weak or sick to work were either gassed in the camp's small gas chamber or killed by lethal injection, a fate met by more than 60,000 victims. It was here that my grandmother's worst memories would be formed. The horrible conditions, the extreme cold, the men and women separated from one another, and the dreadful day my grandmother was able to meet her brother along the fence only to encounter him crying and using hammer and uncle had died of starvation and disease. But for my grandmother, there was no time to mourn. Moving on with determination, she focused on living one day at a time and allowing herself to be transported in her memories to the past, to her childhood with her families, and to dreams for the future of the food and warm house she hoped would be waiting for her after the war. After 3 long months, you can move on, they were loaded onto a train and transported to a third concentration camp 15 hours a day and only took breaks to eat soup. There were no windows in the factory and many people got sick. Men and women were once again able to send him her portion of food for a few days to help him gain strength, and he recovered. On the evening of February 13th, 1945, a series of Allied firebombing raids began against the German city of Dresden, reducing the city to rubble and flames, you can change the slide, and killing 25,000 people. More than 3,400 tons of explosives were dropped on the city by 800 American and British aircraft. The firestorm created by the 2 days of bombing set the city aflame, burning for many days and littering the streets with charred corpses, including many children. My grandmother's factory was hit by one of the bombs. Everything around her was on fire. But the Nazi officers never stopped watching over them, even as the building was partially demolished. They took them out of the building to the courtyard. And my grandmother and I stood in this courtyard a few years ago to go see. It now operates as a tobacco factory. My grandmother described how out of desperation, they were reduced to digging for scraps from the trash cans around them. Sure. They were marched through the burning city to the outskirts where they stayed in a meadow. 2 young women managed to escape in the chaos. One was caught and brought back, and they were forced to watch as she was tortured and killed, and no one escaped after that. The final stage of devastation, go to the next slide, would be the death march. After waiting for a few days, their guards decided to walk them to unknown destination. It was March of 1945. They walked along the river for days, and people who could no longer walk collapsed and were shot on the spot. They were sick, weak, and hungry, but they kept walking on what became later known as the Death March that would last over 2 weeks in freezing conditions. They were walking towards Czechoslovakia. To my grandmother, this period seemed like an eternity. The death marches were the final effort by the Nazis to hold on to slave labor for of armaments, used prisoners. Mother was marching with her mom at the time and a group of 3 young ladies who'd been together on this journey since their time at the Lodz ghetto. She recalls walking through a picturesque small town. She saw curtains on windows, food on tables, and lights in warm houses, and thought that she would never again live like that. These people had beds, family, and food. But out of nowhere, a German civilian came out of the bushes and handed her a piece of bread. She referred to that man as her hero. Had the guards noticed him, he would have been shot on the spot. She always told like this unidentified German civilian who dared to give a starving Jewish girl a piece of bread. Years later, when she shared her testimony with the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation, and I knew none of this at the time, she recalls the following story. She also internet that she shared this with other incidents, and these are blisters on The Nazis would then whistle again, and everyone would get back up. And those who did not were shot. The 5 of us made a pact in our pain and desperation that we would not rise again at the next whistle. We were mentally and physically exhausted into the snow. I felt a profound peace. Everything would now end. And then the whistle blew again, and each one of us jumped up. Our will to live was so strong. 1 week later, the group arrived at a desolate train station at a forested point in the Czech Republic. They were chased and shots were fired in their direction, but their desire to escape gave their starving bodies energy to run. My grandmother recalls that once they were free and liberated, they realized that they had nowhere to go. At the time, for a very short period, she was reunited with her brother, but he ended up dying of disease. Her mother ended up not surviving past liberation in the town of Lodz to discover that nothing from her past life was there. She states that this was the most difficult period for her. Once which was very uncommon, she used her determination to move forward. She regained her health, and with the mentorship of a friend, a non-Jewish friend living in the town, she was able to find work that she loved, and she slowly started rebuilding the life that she had envisioned. Go to the next slide. My grandmother was a survivor of the Holocaust, but that was not the sole focus of her legacy or her identity. She immigrated to Israel, next slide, had 3 children, 15 grandchildren, and over 50 great-grandchildren. You can keep going. That is her legacy. My grandmother influenced my life and continues to. I learned important lessons from her that I carry with me to this day and impart to others. Her first lesson would be one of resilience. She would want us to know that she used her strength to deal with the challenging chapters of her life. She wanted me to remember that when life knocked you down, you always had to get back up. Help others and be sensitive to human suffering. Later in her life, my grandmother turned her insomnia into a gift by helping others. She volunteered at a rape crisis hotline. So in her 80s, she walked around with a little necklace, and she would get a pager anytime somebody needed to talk to her. Many survivors put their energy into making this world a better place by taking action to improve the lives of others. Never when she said it was easier to give up and die. And the most important thing my grandmother taught me is to adapt to circumstances you cannot change, no matter how difficult. You can go to the next slide. Although we have no control over our attitudes and behaviors of others, we can choose how we react in any given situation. She used to talk a lot about anything how you'll respond to the situation. This became a mantra through my life. And to find meaning and purpose in your life. My grandmother always found meaning during the different phases of her life. After the war, she then focused on her career and raising a family. Once my grandfather fell ill, she dedicated herself to his care. For my grandmother, there was an added dimension. She needed to find meaning in her survival. Many survivors found a sense of purpose by bearing witness to accomplish this by becoming a docent at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum. You can switch the picture. And I never knew during her life that she did any of this, because as I told you, by the time she died, I just saw her as a sweet older lady. I later found online there's stories of individuals who went to them and met my grandmother and about their interaction. So she shared this story with the world, but never with her family. My grandmother's survival is an example of the human spirit ability to adapt, rebuild, and recover from genocide. She personally experienced the darkest side of humanity in her life. In Israel, the world stops on Yom HaShoah. In America, we have to take the time to stop, to listen to stories such as my grandmother's, to remember the devastation, to learn from the heroism and determination, and to witness by resolving to combat hate. May we use the sacred responsibility bestowed upon us as witnesses to create meaningful change for the cause of peace in our today. And the last word, the last slide, very appropriate for today, is our remarkable founder, Tess Wise. And this is what motivates me and the reason that I came here to do this work. Ours is a call to remembrance, but also a call to vigilance, and above all, a call to morality. At the end of the day, it must be said that each and every one of us can make a crucial difference. Indeed, we must, if the future is ours. And in Jewish tradition, we say of blessed memory. She has inspired schools, including our wonderful Mitch, to create a huge difference in the future. And there couldn't be a more appropriate time. Today, she's 101. And if she was able to see all of you here, she would truly be inspired. So from the bottom of my heart, did not anticipate speaking, but a huge, huge thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my grandmother's story and to get an opportunity to honor Tess. Have any questions?
We're gonna, does anybody have any questions? We do a brief Q&A.
She was ashamed that she survived. She had an enormous amount of survivor guilt. She was devastated that she had to live a life she didn't know why she survived. All four of my grandparents never shared any of their stories. She had survivor's guilt, and she just did not feel like she was the strongest in the family. She outlived her brother, her mother. And she didn't want us to know. Survivors, first of all, she called herself very common, very common, very common. But I will tell you, a couple years ago, I got invited to speak in Oklahoma, of all places. This is just right. I got invited to speak, and I showed up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And as I was heading to the airport, and I said, "Wow, tell me about her." And she said, "Well, she's from a town called Lodz." And I'm like, "My grandmother too." So like, she was in Auschwitz, but just for weeks. And then she was like, "My grandmother too." Transported to Dresden. By then, I arrived to the airport, and my grandmother too. Well, it turns out they were on the same transport to get the entire time of children, and it tells the story of my grandmother's from day to day. And I met her, and she remembered my grandmother. She's still alive, and she was able to connect me to all these organizations that are doing enormous work. This particular group, this particular transport. She even was able to give me the document that listed that they were on the same transport. And we're still in touch. She's remarkable. But the irony to think that she might be one of the only individuals still alive in transport. And she was in the same grandmother's footsteps. So I went on the death march. I went to go see the factory. I saw where the garbage cans were that they rummaged through. It's turned into a factory, but there's a plaque. This community sought to have a commemorative plaque to say, in this building, a group of women worked in the basement, and very few of them survived that final chapter. So. Yeah. So it's very interesting. I always think that after the Holocaust, when I was little, people used to tell me 6 million, 6 million. That meant nothing to me. I never understood it. But one time someone told me it's like if you take salt and you were just to sprinkle it, everybody ended up scattered completely away from their original community. My story's very unique because each one of my grandparents stayed in Poland. So my grandparents did not want to leave Poland, even though each one of them lost their entire family. They'd never been outside of Poland. They didn't have a life outside of Poland. So this grandmother, who's Alfreda, stayed in Poland until she met my grandfather. They had 2 children, my dad and his brother Michael was born in the forest in 1945. And my dad was born in 1949. And they wanted to rebuild their lives. They wanted to continue. They ended up staying in Poland until 1956, at which point there was so anti-Semitism that the prime minister learned new languages, to find new jobs, to create new lives. And the way they did it was in community. That was the only way they did it, was by figuring out how they were going to move on. I don't have an answer. I don't know how they did it. I think that it's truly a testament. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were embarrassed by their past. They didn't speak about it. They did what they needed to do to move on. Well, there were a lot of incidents after the Holocaust of individuals who came back to their towns to collect their land. There's a great movie, 1945, and many of them were killed. There were actually pogroms after the Holocaust where survivors were killed. They survived the entire war, came back to their hometowns, and were killed because, as we know, anti-Semitism did not end at that point. And individuals, human nature, they now lived in homes, so the homes that were owned by Jewish people were now occupied by the local community. And human nature, nobody stepped out and said, this is your home, welcome back. Those who kept the belongings did return some of the belongings and artifacts that we know 95% of those who came back immediately made their way either to America if they were able to. My parents weren't, many people weren't, or to Israel. When by the time my grandparents arrived, it was already the state of Israel because it was after that period. And they rebuilt. They had no choice. Of course, thank you guys for listening. Yeah, one last thing. Sure. Yes. The USC Shoah Foundation. My grandmother stipulated that after she passed away, her testimony would be available. So one can listen to her testimony. Unfortunately, it's in Hebrew. So you can hear her voice, but you can't hear. And I have one, and we were standing in the room where all of the artifacts, all the material, the actual materials held, and they were talking a testimony that had been destroyed. One of the videos had been destroyed, and that they had been working on now with all the new technology to restore. And I'm standing there in this room, and they said, this woman's testimony is called the miracle testimony. They had literally restored it to its original state. And we're standing in the tour, and there's other people to verify this. And all of a sudden, I hear my grandmother's voice. She was the testimony that they were able to restore. It had been digitally destroyed, and they restored it. And everyone in the room, nobody could story. It was literally like I was standing there and I heard my grandmother's voice. I know. Exactly. I know. It's all a little strange. So my husband says it's coincidence, but I leave that to you to determine. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Talli. So, so I know we don't have that. We only have we have an hour left. We might not even take up the entire hour for sure. But what we're gonna do, we're gonna get set up. Everyone online, just go ahead and stay on. Actually, I had always planned for our next speaker to have a brief moment to come up and do a piece, but I kind of sent a message to her this morning. I said, "You have extra time," and I was very happy that she was willing to kind of jump in, because we have to live on a pivot on a regular basis here, just like everyone online who's finding out how difficult it is when technology only halfway works, and I have no control over that. So I hope that everything works and everyone's able to get something out of this. But I want to introduce our next speaker, Holly Manelkern. And actually, I do have a few of Holly's books that I might give out depending on engagement level and how everyone does here today. Holly Manelkern is a poet, Holocaust educator, and lecturer. After studying with other teachers at Yad Vashem, she's taught here at she actually taught at the Summer Teachers Institute here at the Holocaust Memorial Resource Center, as a recipient of the Thomas Burnett Swan Poetry Prize for 2016. She has her work has appeared in the journals of the National Council of Teachers of English, the Gwendolyn Books Writers Association of Florida, and the Florida State Poets Association. Her most recent poems appeared in Prism Spring 2016. She lives in Winter Park here, and this is her book, Beneath the White Stars. And nobody can see this online, but we have a few copies of it that I may actually be able to give to a few people here today. But with that, I would like to introduce Ms. Holly Manelkern. And hopefully everyone online can hear all right. Okay, just tell me what you need me to do.
Where do you want me to put the posters?
They're going to be able to see them.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Sorry. It's kind of low tech today, but at least I have the opportunity to use illustrations from my book. Yeah, I will. I was just talking to the in-house group. Okay. Okay. All right. That'll work. Thank you, Stephen, for that nice introduction with thousands and thousands of other 8th Air Force men for that special landing at Normandy. My dad was a lead bombardier, which meant that he flew in the first lead plane, and 99 planes followed their course. So they were either right in their charting of what they were doing 100 times, or wrong. So you had to be pretty good to be in that lead plane. And just a little bit more than a month later, my father was shot down on his 27th flying mission over Germany. So he became, as well as his other surviving crew members, prisoners of war in German camps. And being Jewish, that was a precarious situation, because even though the Geneva Accord was in effect, you never really knew if it was going to be followed. So my father did survive. He had something that the prisoners of war also called a death march. At the same time that you were describing, Talli, the end of January, where they were marching from their camp, Stalag Loop 3, south, and they told us approximately 50 years, and they had no proper slide of men in the air. The 8th Air Force had subsidies in the war. I was very fortunate to grow up with a father. With being boosted by hearing, I wanted to keep continuing learning about the Holocaust, and as Stephen mentioned, sometimes, well, for many years actually, I gave a talk on right here, and address that by combining what I knew, what I wanted to keep learning about, and my interest in poetry, to write a book, Beneath White Stars. Now that a little more time opened up for today, I wanted to share with you just a little bit of my poetry and 2 songs. So I start my book with 3 individuals who wrote about their harsh circumstances, but also gazed beyond those circumstances at the stars. And the first poem in my book is called Beneath White Stars. And can you see the illustration here? What's that? Oh, you want what? Okay, all right. Illustration accompanying the first poem. Thank you, merciful Lord, for having arranged so wisely to provide flowers with fragrance, glowworms with the glow, and make the stars in the sky sparkle. Said by Dr. Janusz Korczak in his ghetto diary in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. The seed of a creative idea does not die in mud and scum. Even there, it will germinate and spread its blossom like a star shining in darkness. Said by Peter Gintz in his essay, Wandering Through Theresienstadt, between 1942 and 44. And then the last quote, bright stars, stretched to me your white hand. My words are tears wanting to rest in your hand. And that was written in the Vilna Ghetto on May 22nd, 1943. It's Unter deine weiße Stern, which translates from Yiddish to Beneath Your White Stars. Best of drifting children, past the clouded window, doctor praises designs of stars surpassing humans with intellect. Terezin, mud engraven ground. His ideas rise a fire, unbound. From Vilna's silent cellared holes, Avram beckons God's white hand to reach beneath his pearly stars. Suspended hope in single strands. Two, we heard about him a couple days ago. He was a Jewish pediatrician, educator, author of 24 books, former soldier, from the Polish army, and a radio personality as Mr. Midges in Warsaw, but he focused on the Jewish orphans after the Warsaw Ghetto was established. And he treated each child with great respect. He was offered a way out of the ghetto because of his fame, but he refused it. And though he cared for, taught, nurtured, and doctored the children, he couldn't save them. He and his longtime assistant, Miss Steffa, were the only comfort that the children had. Both stayed with them for the train trip that took them all to Treblinka. But how he treated them while they were in his orphanage is a story not to be forgotten. Here is another illustration from the book of Dr. Korczak, Marching with the Children. And his educational work with children and for parents and teachers is still honored today in Poland and Israel, and his life is celebrated with kite festivals. Kites because in his book, The Religion of the Child, he said, just as a sea gives a child a toy, so the wind has to give him a kite. He was truly a remarkable man. And I'd like to read you my poem about him called His Overtures of Love. I start with the quote from Emily Dickinson. Sasha, she's another of my favorites. Who has not found the heaven below will fail of it above. God's residence is next to mine. His furniture is love. The furnishings are spare at the orphanage who divide the space by day for classrooms, reading corner, workshop, club rooms, the scale to weigh furniture. By night, partitions drift to make a dormitory of beds for 200 children. Miss Steffa rests in the east end. In the west, his own bed in the center, flanked by the beds of the sick children. Proud patriot buries under his daily garb to wear at home solicits potatoes and undeliverable packages from the ghetto post office. His furniture is love. Table of fountain pen and pencils, sharpened at both ends, wait for his words when he welcomes the beautiful silence of the night. His ghetto diary is grim, unlike his book of the boy King Matt, How to Love a Child, The Child's Right to Respect, and his other bestsellers. His signature is love. Doctor chooses the last play, The Post Office, for July. It features sparkling stars, circle prizes on the children if they don't want them. After all, a long time. His theater is love. Now, Peter of us here who have really formed a tremendous amount of admiration for Peter Gentz. And mine started a long time ago. And so I've written a couple of poems about him. But first I want to tell you, just refresh your memory, he was mentioned a couple days ago. To be creative in a camp like Theresienstadt or Terezin in Czechoslovakia was no small achievement. Peter Gentz's family lived in Prague, where he's pictured in this drawing, where by the age of 14 and a half, a Czech Esperanto dictionary. He was Ishling. He was to the concentration camp of Terezin, where the bare necessities, this is the same camp where we saw the Requiem, where the bare necessities were not even met. Peter kept up his studies, his reading, his art, and his writing. He kept monthly journals, records, he called his plans for what he hoped to. Checked out books from a library consisting of books confiscated by Jewish inmates at Terezin, and his self-assigned reading list was extensive. Descartes, H.G. Wells, sociology and pedagogy text, Jack London, Plato, Oscar Wilde, Dickens, you know, just like your regular kids in your class, right? Albert Schweitzer, studies of Eastern religions, and more. And in this camp, he created black and white drawings, paintings, maps, and woodcuts on a regular basis. He was also concerned about his fellow inmates, and for nearly 2 years, he wrote articles for a secret weekly journal, Vedem, which means in the lead, writings and drawings done by the 100 boys in his barracks, and this was illegal to do this. These were weekly single issues of this journal. They were buried when Peter was deported to Auschwitz and later recovered after the war by one of the boy writers who was spared. Peter could have become anything, and he already had become a person of distinction when his short life ended at the age of 16 and a half when he was sent to Auschwitz. In the year 2000, an asteroid was discovered by 2 Czech astronomers, and they named it after him. So I'd like to read to you my poem, one of my poems honoring him, called Lines in Space, that starts with a brief quote from Jules Verne. Well, I feel we should always put a little art into what we do. It's better that way. Young Da Vinci. Peter Gintz, number 446, leaving Prague on a 4th trip, October 22nd, 1942 night, on an unnamed transport to Theresienstadt, packed his bags, kept a mental log of his 10-kilogram limit, rather light, tools to illustrate his book on wizards and mountains, a manuscript, paper and paper, thin leather to bind, his Jules Verne's favorite, left behind. He took a few broken watercolor paints, linocut knives for rockets, ships. With woodcuts, he saw the same arches, planes, curves, calm lines, his precious suitcase he hoped to find. Peter Gintz, 1880 his number, forced on a trip to unfamiliar parts, September 28, 1944. No provisions for food or slumber, calmly left Theresienstadt. He knew this world through how they swore, but drew world maps, moon landscape, charts. Linocut knives had schooled his heart. He traveled far through Jules Verne's art, his own journeys now cut short. Waiting for him to board the train, Sister reached to touch his hand that now held 2 pieces of bread, nothing for his piercing mind. Peter Gintz, asteroid 50413, named by 2 astronomers, Czech, orbits the sun every 4+ years. Golden asteroids, Verne's frontiers. Arches, arcsects, apogees, planes, calm lines, curves, degrees. Lines in space, Peter's spheres. Thank you. Can you imagine if we had a child like that in our class, how inspired we would be? So through memory, through remembering him, I feel like we can still feel that there are children under in a world of filth around them and the beauty of the imagination. It is a true inspiration. Abraham Sutzkever. I could write a whole book on Abraham Sutzkever. Here he is in his hat. He's another extremely amazing person. He was a poet who became a fighter and survived. Abraham Sutzkever was born in Siberia, and then the family moved to Vilna, Lithuania. He was a respected poet who was largely self-educated. He was pretty sickly as a child. In 1941, he was sent with his wife and mother to the Vilna ghetto, and he tried in vain to protect his mother, whom he feared was carted away. He wrote poetry in cellars and other dark places to document this life, and also he taught poetry to young people in the ghetto to keep their creativity alive and their spirits up. He felt, and he felt this down to his bones, that poetry could conquer death. When words were not enough, he became a fighter, a partisan, treading through the swamp forest, and most of them never held a weapon in their life before. And legend has it that he and other Jewish partisans melted down the lead plates of a very prominent printing press called the Ram Printing Press, a printer of beautiful religious and secular books in Vilna. And why did they melt it down? To make bullets. So these letters, once the building blocks of sacred text, would be used to preserve life itself. So I'm going to just flip this over a little bit. You can see him under the tree with his weapon. The word Zakor, which means remember, and he's in the forest and he's under the beautiful stars, which he wrote about, himself. He wrote about that, and he wrote a beautiful song that was actually taught, turned to a song, and sung in the ghetto. And this is probably one of the most well-known pieces of music from the Holocaust times, Unter deine weiße Stern, Beneath Your White Stars. So, as I said, this man and his wife were rescued on the orders from the forest, on the orders of the president in exile of Lithuania, who was a poet himself, who had translated Sutzkever's earlier poems in 1940. So who said that being a poet doesn't pay? His poetry writing actually is what had saved him. And after the war, his record keeping and his poetic records were used, and his voice itself, as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. He and his wife moved to Israel, where he edited Israel's only major literary journal in Yiddish called The Golden Chain. And some of its pages included poems in Yiddish and illustrations by his close friend, Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall, right. And actually, making this story, Starry Night, all of them, he himself, the illustrator, was influenced by Chagall and was so motivated by the story of Sutzkever that he did a lot of illustrations of Sutzkever, feeling that very Chagallian influence. And I'd like to read you a poem about Sutzkever. It's short because it's a sonnet. Those of you who know poetry know sonnets are 14 lines, so bear with me. Unter deine weiße Stern, a sonnet for Sutzkever. At night, I look through darkened doors ajar for Mama. I, the pitted plum that bears within the nest, the bird, the tree, have fears that wagons cart her Sabbath shoes to war. I wait for your white hand beneath your star to stretch through snowy night and hold my tears. From cellared holes, dear God, I search the years past rooftops where your shelter stands afar. By night, we raid the printer's plates of lead that once engraved the Golden Chain's old script. For arms, we melt the ingrained voice of scrolls, while dreamers turn to soldiers forge ahead. We sing a hymn to swamps, once nondescript. We shoulder sacred rifles on our souls. Today we heard about the role of the Pope and the Catholic Church. And there's another part of this story, which was, of course, alluded to. It wasn't the topic of today, but there were a number of priests who took it upon themselves to rescue Jewish children, saving hundreds of Jewish children by placing them in convents and monasteries was risky for the rescuer and also life-changing for the children, who would have to assume a new identity, forget their past, and deal with missing their parents. So this was true for Belgian priest Father Bruno, formerly known as Henry Rendiers, who disguised himself to hide children in monasteries and convents and to continue to stay in touch with them. So it wasn't just a one-drop move for him. He kept in touch with them and made sure that they were taken care of. He also insisted after the war that they, whenever it was possible, to be returned to their parents, that happened as quickly as possible. And he did not want children converted to Catholicism. He wanted them restored to their Jewish traditions. I was privileged to meet one of the children that he rescued. Her name was Flora Singer, was her married name. She was a docent at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and as soon as I went into the museum with another teacher, she rushed us. She said, "You have to come see this first." So we went to the Rescuers Hall, and she pointed to the name of Father Bruno, and she said, "This man was a saint." And she said, "If you don't remember anything else about this museum, this man was a saint." So what I wanted to tell you is that I have a poem about him, but because of the event that I mentioned to you in late June, I would like today, I'm going to put you on the spot here for the click for the music. We're going to do something special for that. Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, you're going to. Okay. So, ordinarily, I had probably had a lot of time to prepare. I would have given you the lyrics, but the person who's going to sing this song is the man who's coming at the end of the month. This is Brendan Nolan, and he's going to be singing this story called Kissing the Wall about Father Bruno.
Okay, really quick. This is high tech. I'm doing this so everyone online can hear, since there's been an issue with the sharing as far as sharing goes. Oh. Well,
Sorry, another Irish musician. That's the last one. We're gonna do is Kissing the Wall. That's it. I was getting internet.
Jack goes boarded the train to Mazig Belgium under the cloak of Father Bruno. The hide and seek that he allowed. Though hiding Jews, it was no game now. False IDs, food ration cards, new last names, new religion. With white-robed Jewish boys and girls, Rachel Silverman in Bruges by the North Sea. at the convent of Franciscan sisters. She carried a blue coat she called Bonini. In the steeples of kneeling stools, the cold it covered cold their knees, yet they spoke with light in their eyes. Before the war of Palatine, my parents are coming, my parents are coming, because our kind father reigns. My parents are here, because our kind father for a Mandela that's so prosperous, bike all through the country, hiding Jewish kids and spinning hymns. Dumb dressed apart of several people, his shorn head hidden a beret he wore. The ration cards fed hundreds of children, recycled as orphans through convent doors. He had to move Flora again to Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows, where she thrived. Thank you to the sisters and to Father Bruno, the Benedictine who saved the life. Our guide at the museum, now it's Flora. She points to his name in the rescuer's hall. She says, he was a saint, if there ever was one. As she bent and kissed the wall, my parents are coming, my parents are coming, because our kind father reindeers. My parents are coming, my parents are here, because of kind father reindeer. Ave Bruno reindeer.
Music by Brendan Nolan. I wrote the lyrics. The vocals and guitar were by Brendan. Fiddle was by Colin Farrell, not the movie star. There's a very prominent musician here in Central Florida who travels all around named Colin Farrell. And backing vocals were by Michelle Amato, who is a very lovely vocalist in our area. And I wanted to close with the quotes with the three people, with Peter Gens, with Dr. Korchak, and with Abraham Sitzkaber. So the very last song on the album is based on that poem, but because that was the first poem and it's the last song on the album, you know, what do we do when we're teachers? We try to, what do we do at the end? We try to gather up and reevaluate and remeasure and remember. So these are the words that it took on as the song at the end. Beneath white stars, from Vilna's silent cellared holes, Avram beckons, not yet. It's just, I have to always tell Brendan, not yet, not yet. Avram beckons God's light hand to reach beneath his pearly stars, suspended hope in single strands. Peter tills with intellect, Terrazine's mud-engraven ground. His ideas rise like shining stars and orbit still, a fire unbound. Pavel Friedman and Anne Frank report their worlds, though far apart. He misses yellow butterflies. She yearns for stars. She can chart. A child adrift in wartime current. Suitcase packed for journeys far. Precious things, the sole companion, guided by glimmering stars. And who is that child adrift in wartime currents? It could be someone you learned about this week. It could have been Tess Wise when she was dislocated from her, uprooted from her surroundings. Some of the many children that we talked about this week who are adrift in the wartime currents. So this song that Steve's going to play for us is by Dave Curley. I wrote the lyrics, and Dave Curley is a young Irish musician who is one of the lead Irish musicians in the world. And it's a long story about how he ended up on an album, but it's a happy one. And the vocals and guitar are by Dave. The fiddle and whistle is by Colin Farrell, who was on the other song. And backing vocals are by, who was a prominent Irish singer named Ashley Davis. So this is the closing song, Beneath White Stars. Thank you so much for your attention. I do encourage you, not everybody loves poetry, but you would be really surprised at how much children love to write poetry. And one of the biggest bonuses I think about encouraging children to write poetry is that this is a really big story, and it makes you focus a little bit on what do you want to reflect on. And I found that to be true for myself. And like these issues that I've written poems about, when you knit and pick over every word you choose, which is what you do in poetry, you're trying to choose the most clear, the most vivid word. And I think I remember, I think about Abraham Sutzkever, writing president in exile of Lithuania. His poems were read in Israel. His poems were read by a poetry class that I took. Then his poems were read by me. And then my poem about Sutzkever goes from me to you. And then if you read a poem about him, it goes from you to your student. And then, like when I was working with musicians, so then it carried down the whole chain, and I have a song on the album about Avram Sutzkever. So then what happens is then it goes for either for a professional musician or for maybe somebody in your class who loves music. Then it goes to the brain and the voice and the soul and the heart of the voice of the instruments chosen. So it's a whole line of reinforcing reflection and the deepening of the message. And the personalizing of the message. Poetry doesn't have to be poetry that's going to win a literary prize, but the fact that it will resonate. And some people are really visual artists and are very attracted to, to maybe that would encourage other people to on the subject. So, and then I did history accounts. I want to know all to do what you love, do what resonates for you. And that, of course, will resonate at the highest vibrancy with your students. So thank you so much.
Talli's story, Talli, not a bad afternoon, considering things got ended. Such a beautiful way to end the day, especially when we typically are talking about really horrible things. I think this was really a great way to end our Thursday. So look, you've almost made it to the very end. So hopefully, as we're going through this, you're finding all this useful. And I think one of the someone else at the end of last year is I really want to be a professional development that when it ends, you're not exactly happy. You're tired, you're exhausted, you're mentally drained, you're thinking about things, but you're not like looking. There are those PDs, and you're like, can we be done? Is it done? Can I pretend that I'm here and not be here? Things like that. I was that person who sat in the back, hoping that I was close enough to the door to be able to work my way out. And whether they saw it or not, I'd go to the bathroom and not come back. I did that a lot. But I hope that you're getting something out of these sessions, whether you're in person or whether you are virtual, as best as you try. If you notice, there's so many different ways that you can approach this topic. It's beyond a way that really can be connected with your students. And I think that if you give one takeaway from the entire week, that's great, that you can do this. No matter what class you're teaching, what grade you're teaching, there are things that you can do and be effective and be just as powerful as you're always being as an educator, but hopefully you're leading with new partnerships, new friendships, new ideas, new places to share and get information from. Today, just so everyone who's here knows, we have a new exhibit. It's temporary for the month of June. It's a D-Day exhibit that is out right now. We are having an event tonight that's opening of this exhibit on the Borscht Belt. So that means there's a presenter who's coming here. They're going to turn this room temporarily into something different because there's going to be little, drinks and things of that nature. So that means everyone is going to have to exit and leave like immediately as soon as we close. I'd love to have you all hang out. You're more than welcome to hang out in the front of the museum and the exhibit. We just kind of have to close things up here. Tomorrow I'm expecting a big full house because I know a lot of people are wanting to show up. Tomorrow, Echoes and Reflections, Women in Resistance. It'll be a great session for the morning. I hope you have a great day. Thank you all for everything. Take care.